Clovis roamed the glacial tills of the Montana Highline as a boy, he hadn't yet realized that he was walking in the footsteps of the very first Montanans who lived there over 13,000 years ago. But he would become a renowned Montana archaeologist and take it upon himself to embark upon his search for the first Montanans. This is a story of archaeology in Montana, and one man's quest to find evidence of the first people to live and prosper there. In July of 1967, in far eastern Lindsay, Montana, dry land farmer Joe Walker was running his combine along the Dawson County Road when he spied some white chalky material weathering out of the borrow pit. Upon closer examination, he was stunned by its size and thought that it looked like pieces of a fossilized elephant tusk. News of the find made its way to Montana State University in Bozeman, and young PhD candidate Les Davis was hired to direct the Lindsay Mammoth Recovery Project. Over 30 hot days in July and August, Davis and 6 students painstakingly uncovered the massive mammoth grave. Like a Greek statue carved from a block of stone, the extinct Pleistocene elephant emerged from the Ice Age silt. Here was Davis's first big archaeological puzzle, and he treated it forensically, as though it were a crime scene. He observed 9 small angular blocks of sandstone associated with the mammoth skeleton. However, there was no sandstone outcrop nearby. How did the sandstone blocks get there?
But those 9 pieces of sandstone don't refit together. And none of them show any use as hammering and battering. But the question is, why are there 9 pieces of sandstone either touching or lying next to parts of the mammoth skeleton?
A clue came from the mammal's front femurs. They were crushed as if a human might have extracted their protein-rich marrow. Davis was also suspicious of the unnatural way in which the bones were arranged. On close examination, he noticed what appeared to be cut marks on the bones that might have been caused by butchering with stone tools. The crew sealed the exposed bones with resin and later cast them in plaster for the trip to Montana State University. Davis would study the mammoth for the rest of his career. Eventually, PhD candidate Catherine Krasinski confirmed his suspicion that the cut marks on some of the bones were made by humans.
It's radiocarbon dated now at 13,500 years, which is about 2,000 years earlier than Clovis complex. So it is pre-Clovis. But they did come upon an injured or dead mammoth They scavenged the skeleton, took it apart, stacked bones on top of one another like only humans can do, rearranged other bones, the tusks, the teeth, and left cuts on the bones of stone tools.
The Lindsay Mammoth was a mature, 50-year-old Columbian mammoth bull, standing 14 feet tall at the top of its bulbous head. The deathbed was only 12 miles south of the terminus of the continental ice sheet, which covered nearly all of Canada and the northern tier of the United States. As the ice melted, lakes formed along the edge of the receding glacier. The warming climate dried the meltwater lakes, and strong winds carried the fine lake silts across the landscape, much like the Dust Bowl of the early 20th century. The Lindsay Mammoth was preserved under 4 feet of this fine wind-blown sediment. Now, early in his career, Davis became a professor of anthropology at Montana State University. He was about to embark on a 40-year odyssey seeking clues to the prehistoric habitation of Montana. The headwaters of the Missouri River, a fertile confluence of 3 major Rocky Mountain drainages in Montana. A place where wildlife and people naturally congregate. In 1971, Davis learned about a mysterious rock outcrop overlooking the Madison River north of Three Forks, Montana.
We discovered one day when a rancher came up and said, "What the hell are you doing out here?" And I said very calmly, "I'm Les Davis. I'm professor of anthropology at Montana State University, and we're here developing one of the most important archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. Who are you?" "I'm Floyd Schmidt. I own this place." But we became very good friends, and he permitted us to work there for the next 17 years.
Every spring over those 17 years, Davis brought his Intro to Archaeology classes to the quarry to study and help dig out the ancient site.
It's an absolutely impressive prehistoric mine. All radiocarbon dates, which there's a whole sequence of dates less obtained for the site, and projectile point styles are exclusively what we call Pelican Lake, or Late Archaic, a large corner-notched atlatl-sized point that ranges from approximately 3,000 to about 1,800 radiocarbon years before present.
This is an extreme case of the extent to which prehistoric peoples went to acquire high-quality stone. We presume that they mined deep into limestone bedrock to obtain unweathered chert. It's a glassy material highly desired for tool making. The chert occurs in many colors and forms in this quarry site, principally brown and reddish materials of high quality. They occur as nodules and as lenses inside of the limestone where they formed by replacing the limestone materials with silicates. They've used a hammerstone to batter from this surface and remove flakes. These flakes then were later worked using pressure techniques to form the various kinds of tools that were necessary to sustain life. Projectile points, knives, scrapers, perforating tools, cutting, all kinds of implements that they found necessary.
What's really interesting about the Schmidt site is it is a true hard rock mine. These people were hammering their way through massive amounts of limestone bedrock and actually tunneling back through the limestone bedrock as well.
During the years leading up to 1976, the country prepared to celebrate the American Revolution bicentennial. Film student Richard McCallum was taking Davis's intro to archaeology class, and he needed a subject for his senior film. Davis and McCallum collaborated to produce The Changing Dawn, a philosophical film recreation of the Pelican Lake people working the Schmid Chert mine. This was an opportunity for Davis to bring to life the culture of these industrious Native Americans, whose chert mining activities sustained many generations of families in this remote Rocky Mountain headwaters. With a mere $3,000 bicentennial grant, they enlisted students from the class as actors and created one of the earliest film representations of Stone Age lifestyles in Montana.
In this year of our bicentennial celebration, we can learn from the ingenuity and courage shown by earliest men. Indeed, the day may come when the teachings of archaeology can be applied as history to the problems of today and tomorrow. By establishing archaeological sites as historic landmarks and national monuments, future generations will be enabled to appreciate the strivings, successes, and high spirit of those who went before.
I think I would have thrown my hands up in frustration at the nature of the disturbance of this site, and how less even understood how deep to go always amazed me. I would have stopped again when we start hitting large, massive pieces of limestone bedrock, pieces the size of a Volkswagen. And no, Les would send students down into the pit without eye protection, without helmets, with sledgehammers, and we'd reduce giant boulders into pieces big enough to fit into these small rubber buckets, which were then roped up a makeshift wooden slide, while other students, also equally unprotected, are bent over in the pit below excavating, while tons of rock are being lifted out over their heads.
The rock just kind of caved in on me, caved in my head, shoulders, and somehow instinctively I just kind of flopped out, rolled out to the one side, and some of those rocks kind of rolled down on my feet and ankles.
And we can laugh about it now, but what I remember most from that experience with Steve was, for what was it, 2 weeks, you had to wear a tank top to all the classes because your road rash was so horrific on his shoulders.
And I had stitches in my head, top of the head up here.
And amazingly, Les never lost a student, although major injuries always occurred. But those were different times. I mean, there was no thought of lawsuits or the need for any kind of safety.
They mined there from about 1300 BC till 200 AD. It's about a 1500-year span of time. And as we reckon generations, you divide about 40 into that, and you'll see how many generations were active in doing this. Now this is where they mined it and made a few tools, but they basically carried this chert that they had extracted down to what is now a large cultivated field of about 350 acres. They took it down there, built their fires, cooked, ate, and worked the stone. And we have very large collections that were made in the cultivated field and can compare what they were doing there with what they were doing in the mine.
This is a good example of one of the ribs that was used at the Schmid site by the people who were mining the chert nodules at the Schmid site. It's a very long, well-preserved piece of rib. It comes to this rounded, polished tip, the result of this being used extensively, digging and prying and so forth.
There are pieces of clamshell that have been drilled to make a flat bead, and then there are lines around the beads, a decorative thing. A couple of shells that have been sort of notched like combs. So there's a lot of what we would think of as women's stuff in the mine. Of course, there are many women's tools in the mine.
And here are a couple exquisite bone artifacts that probably didn't have to do with mining of chert, but rather, my guess is that they had more to do with domestic activities. This is a beautiful, highly polished perforating tool that comes to a very sharp end and with these remarkable decorations on it.
I found 4 olivella shells from the Pacific Ocean that had been drilled through both ends, and they were all found lying together in one place.
There was a lot of prehistoric exchange and trade of different kinds of goods and products that are reflected here. It's interesting that it took place that long ago, but it points out that native peoples were interacting very early and were not just isolated groups of people maintaining their own distinctive cultures. There are generalized lifeways that persist here for more than 11,500 years, and certainly right on down to the time of Columbus and beyond, even to the time of the arrival of Lewis and Clark.
Enormous amount of projectile points. They used the atlatl and dart, so-called spear thrower, during that 1,500-year period.
So it really opened my eyes. One of Les's things is we never dig deep enough, and I think Schmid is a great example of just that.
In 1975, the United States Congress was about to designate 149 miles of the Upper Missouri River as a National Wild and Scenic River. The Bureau of Land Management contracted with Montana State University to survey the stretch from Fort Benton to the western end of Fort Peck Reservoir for evidence of prehistoric occupations. Les Davis and project supervisor Steve Auberg scanned the terraces along the sides of the river, looking for fire hearths or bones eroding out of the riverbank.
We'd set up camp, we'd work for maybe a week, 10 days out of one camp, and then we'd move on down. The BLM would resupply us. They had a big John boat and they could move up and down river, and they would resupply us.
Along this stretch of the Missouri, Davis documented the transition from atlatl hunters, represented by the Pelican Lake points at Holmes Terrace, to the Avonlea bow and arrow culture at Lost Terrace.
We're excavating the Holmes Terrace archaeological site that's located along the Upper Missouri Wild and Scenic River in the vicinity of Big Sandy, Montana. This floor dates probably about 2,500 years ago and represents the surface occupied by early bison hunters here along the Missouri. At least during 6 intervals, prehistoric peoples occupied this landform, and we'd recovered the bone and tools and fire-broken rock that represents those occupations. Here we're excavating the deepest prehistoric occupation in Holmes Terrace. It's here at this point slightly over 2.9 meters below modern surface. We radiocarbon dated a zone here by reference to bison bone in 1977, and it dated about 1000 BC.
One foggy morning in July, archaeologist Steve Auberg was surveying the bank of the river with binoculars. He spotted a thin horizontal layer of mammal bones, plus the remnants of a fire hearth 12 feet below the surface of the cut bank. Auberg and Davis decided to investigate the archaeological site that would later become known as Lost Terrace. It turned out to be one of the most unusual prehistoric campsites they had ever seen. Bison were usually abundant in this lush prairie, and they were the preferred food source. They also provided bones, horns, hooves, sinew, and hides as raw materials. As Davis said, the bison afforded a hardware store-like stock of raw materials essential for life support. But the bison were nowhere to be found that fateful winter. Perhaps a harsh or early cold snap caused the bison herds to remain farther south. Auberg had discovered a rare pronghorn antelope kill site from 1,000 winters ago.
The real hard time was the early spring, because their fat supplies would be depleted. The fat supplies of other species on which they would be dependent upon are also depleted. It just depends on how long is it from the break of winter into true spring. This is the critical season for many game species. And humans, of course, under these circumstances would also be subject to those kind of stresses.
Out of necessity, the resourceful Avonlea people went after a population of pronghorn for winter sustenance. Zoo archaeologist Michael Wilson determined that the remains of 84 adults and 25 unborn pronghorn were unearthed at this kill site, representing one winter of occupation.
So they possessed the know-how. They were keen observers of every living thing. Even though they didn't hunt pronghorn, they knew everything there was to know about pronghorn behavior. And when forced by circumstances, that is, unavailable bison and being in difficult condition, they could kill pronghorn. They had the technology for it. They understood the behavior. They would just adapt their technology and their hunting techniques to another species.
In his mission to discover the secrets of Montana's deep past, Davis often presented his findings on Montana public television in the 1980s and 90s. Here, in a segment from Montana Archaeology in the 80s, Davis showed evidence of the pronghorn kill at Lost Terrace.
So we have to pass all of the sediments that we remove by excavation through a very fine screen in order to recover these very fine residues. Here, for example, the skeletal remains of nearly 50 unborn pronghorn antelope. These unborn pronghorns are about 3 months from full term. So it's late winter, February to March activity. And we can compare their sizes from one animal to another, and again deduce the stage of development they were in at the time. Their mothers were killed by prehistoric hunters using bow and arrow.